Thank you.
First, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always humbling to speak to other thinkers, activists, and academics. Let me begin by saying that a lot of my research is driven by the use of police violence and the institutionalized killing of Black people in the United States. My work presupposes that the killing of Black people and other racialized groups are necessary to the order and structure of what we call American democracy. And as such, many of the liberal tenets, what I take to be more conservative elements of Black thought, as well as the work on race and race theory, do not capture that. Specifically, my work veers off because I'm interested in the disaggregation of violence that's directed towards racialized males. So as we saw with the public execution of Mr. Floyd, we have seen roughly 2,200 Black men be killed in such a manner by police in the United States since 2014. Black women have also been killed around, that number is also around 220, 230. The point being is that this has become a normalized aspect of policing. It has also become a strategy of racial management. One of the things that's happened over the last few weeks is, of course, people have followed Black Lives Matter. We've seen an uproar of riots, even amongst the COVID pandemic. But fundamental questions, in my view, still have not been asked. What are the processes that allow for such things to happen? What role, what function, what purpose does this serve in the overall order of American society? How long can the system keep absorbing riots, protests, and disengagement from academics, citizens, et cetera, before there inevitably will be a collapse? These are questions that take a back seat often to how we think of protest and policy in the United States, but one that nonetheless must be answered. Our reflections on the death of Black people usually tend towards political solutions. How many people will raise their voices, many people will demonstrate, protest and march for Black people being killed. But this idea of Black people being killed or Black people needing recognition fails to deal with both the economic, the political economic structure, the mass incarceration system that underlies many of the segregational logics that we see happen in cities like Minneapolis. Despite its pretense for progressive thought, Minneapolis is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, not unlike other northern cities. Contrary to popular belief, segregation did not only exist in the Jim Crow South, it was part and parcel of American culture well into the 1970s. So what we're witnessing today is the separation, both residentially and on a strict racial basis, where Black people and other racialized minorities are kept separate from white racial groups. Part of this segregational logic, as we've known for the last, almost the last century, certainly coming out of the 20th century, is that segregation tends towards the allowing of dehumanization and dehumanizing ideas. There is a lesser aspect, a lesser subhuman ideology that surrounds these kinds of residential, economic, and political structures that separate races in the United States. And I think that the killing of Mr. Floyd, again, repeats some of these ideas, that because Mr. Floyd was seen as less than human, that it was okay for his life to be taken. Specifically, my research is interested in how these dehumanized ideas surround racialized men in the United States, specifically Black men. So one of the things that we're constantly seeing is that more aggression, more abuse, less empathy that American societies have with racialized men, specifically Black men. People like Philip Adam Goff's work, which suggests that Black people are akin to apes, especially males of those outgroups. We see constant triggers for white American population. We're even hearing the name of a Black man or a Latino man, triggers a fight or flight response. We see media caricatures of Black men as deviants, sexual threats, rapists, hyper-aggressive. These are cultural growths or effects that seem to buttress the segregational logics and systems that we see before us in the United States right now. And I think that while the protests are going on, these have to become front and center. Our ideas of what's actually causing separation and igniting violence has to be dealt with. Because as we saw when Black Lives Matter started with Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, over time, the system readjusts. Systems absorb mass protest. They pass legislation that calms the sea, so to speak, but it does not fundamentally change the quality of life or the orientation that people in power have towards those groups. And I think that's what's constantly missing from our conversations. It's one thing to march for Mr. Floyd, it's one thing to march for Ms. Taylor. But when we're looking at a system that thrives off of the death of Black people, this is not merely an issue of recognition. My suggestion is that the orders that we see play out over and over again in the United States are part of a kind of racial theater where white people get both a cyclical and a social benefit to the murder of Black people, especially Black men. This is how civil society is maintained, by constantly eliminating out-group threats. We know that from some of the formability studies and the work of benevolent sexism, that when we're actually looking at white populations, patriarchal violence is geared towards other male groups that they see as being threats to their racial endogamy and the sustenance and the biological reproduction of their race. I think these ideas all fit with how we're actually looking at Mr. Floyd. We're having to prove that Mr. Floyd's still a human being. And while there's been a mass outrage by white liberals and leftists in the United States, the fundamental gear is whether or not we're outraged by the spectacle that we saw, or whether or not we're actually looking at how we understand racialized populations. I'm much more skeptical on the latter view. I do not think America has yet moved to the place where it fully appreciates the humanity of Black people. I think that that may in fact be an impossibility. And insofar as it's impossible to appreciate Black people as human, we're going to see the repetition of this kind of violence as we've seen for the last 150 years in the United States. Those problems are the kinds of problems that we need activists and academics to think about. Quests for recognition are only short-lived. As we see, we can say his name or say her name over and over again. We went through this with Tamir Rice, we went through this with Michael Brown, we went through this with Trayvon Martin, and yet again, we still get a Mr. George Floyd. I think that this is going to be, we're going to see another Mr. Floyd in the future. So the question is, how do we organize around the idea of protecting the value of Black life? What kind of structures, what kind of activism, what kind of ideas are being brought to bear on how we think about that? I think we also have to have a renewed skepticism about the democratic platforms that are growing out of the United States. It becomes very important to recognize that this is an election year. So a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the things that we're going to see as tangible benefits from social unrest and social protests are in many ways going to play to the Democratic national platform. They're going to play in the hands of Biden, given the massive unpopularity that people like Donald Trump have in the United States amongst liberals. But key issues, qualified immunity that the police has that was given by the Supreme Court in Graham, different issues of how we see the interaction between police, their purpose, and minority communities, the need for police to protect the kind of property rights and protect the segregational boundaries with white populations, white citizens in the suburbs. These have not been things that we're very active in talking about. The other day, they ran minority communities still can't get to polls, right? So there's an active disenfranchisement at the same time that we're seeing this kind of massive call for democratic rights and recognition. Until we get a handle on this massive structure, on these various complexes, I think that it's really a distraction for us to assert that Black Lives Matter in a system that's built in the dehumanization of Black life. And while I understand the popular slogan, in the United States, there's a huge gap between the BLM organization and working class Black people in places like Ferguson that are still trying to draw our attention to how poverty, police brutality, and social isolation in these cities are not being addressed at a national level. Said differently, there are classes of Black people and white liberal philanthropic organizations that have been using the deaths of poor Black people to motivate a media spectacle that still does not address what we're seeing and witness every day. So until we can get a handle on how all these things interact and how we can actually explain the processes of their interaction, I'm quite pessimistic about how this is going to go. I think the riots do express a kind of dishonesty, or rather the recognition of a dishonesty about the system. But I think Black people have been expressing this kind of distrust for quite some time. I think this was the basis of Black power, it's the basis of the civil rights movement, and we've seen no arrest to the ideas. In fact, we've pushed liberalism and democracy even farther, saying that if we become more democratic, become more liberal, that these will in fact offer solutions to the kind of murderous rage that we see growing in the white population. A.J. William Myers once said in Destructive Impulses that the order of American democracy is founded upon the killing of Black people. And I think we really need to revisit that kind of sentiment. People like Derek Bell, more recently, people like Frank Wilderson, have really tried to get us to think about the inadequacies, not only of democracy, but Western humanism to carry the weight of Black humanity. And while I have my intellectual issues with Afro-pessimism, it nonetheless speaks to a very real sentiment, which is that there cannot be any kind of validation or respect for Black life on a system that's built on Black death. This is a very hard sentiment, I think, for people to truly understand, because it rings as pessimistic. People want to have a belief that economic reformation, distributive justice, passing more laws, in fact, can address and solve the race problem. But I think that when you're looking at the evidence, rising unemployment, how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected Black people, specifically older Black men, when you're looking at the decrease in home ownership and the financial stability of entire communities, the silence that the government has towards their well-being, suggesting that we value Black life without creating the conditions for Black life to flourish seems to be hypocritical, if not dishonest at the very best. And that's the situation I think Black Americans find themselves in. When that message spreads throughout the rest of the world, it's based on a goodwill, a benevolence that citizens in European countries, in fact, understand and see the humanity of Black people. But is that something that's been historically worked out? As I spent more time in the UK, I become increasingly pessimistic that the UK, even Scotland, is this progressive oasis, that's sheltered from all the racism of the bad American West. I see that there's a kind of complacency in the way that colonialism has, in fact, situated the assimilation of strategies that places like Scotland has. So whereas Scotland may say, look, we don't have a very broad population, so race isn't a problem here. When you're looking at the United States, they have a larger racial population, so that's managed through violence. Here is mostly assimilation strategies. It's harsh immigration controls. It's people not wanting certain people to cross borders. But that's the historical circumstance of the colony. In the United States, because Black people within the borders, you see high levels of violence, high levels of police restraint, white vigilantism, right? These white people become deputized to enforce anti-Blackness. And that's not something that you can legislate. So regardless of the kinds of reforms that's passed, that's not going to change the mindset the white vigilantes have to assassinate and publicly lynch somebody like Mr. Arbery, right? This is a systematic and cultural phenomenon where white people in the United States fundamentally hold the belief that there are superior beings to Black people, and furthermore, that there should be no penalty for killing Black people, especially Black men. And until we get a focus, right, on the specific trajectory or the specific catalysts that are igniting the kinds of antipathies and aversions towards Black males that we see in the United States and abroad, this is going to be putting a Band-Aid on an open wound. We simply do not have the understandings as of yet to truly appreciate how Black men are being positioned in the system that deprives them of any kind of economic mobility. So the only way that people can be dealt with is fundamentally as a threat. They can only be understood as posing a danger to the civil society. And it's in that way that we have to start looking at this problem, not as a fix of recognition, but as one that tries to place different bodies at different places. One that's trying to organize Black male bodies within prisons, within an undercast in the economy. This kind of death ethic or ethos that we see growing in America, or that's constantly persisting, is one that's trying to take care of what people who think are trying to take care of a population that white people think are merely an access, right? And it is a pessimistic problem. It's a problem that constantly breeds dissent. It's a problem that's constantly being legislated, but nonetheless one that still remains despite all the progress we think we've made with civil rights movement and with Black Lives Matter over the last decade.